Welcome to the second part of 2 sessions of gardening in and outdoors with the wonderful, fabulous, amazing Jewish farmer, go figure, they do exist, Nate Looney. Last time we did a session on kind of outdoor gardening, so like container gardening and gardening if you have like a backyard, like how do you start and where do you go? And this time we're talking about indoor gardening. So that's going to cover kind of a variety of subjects of which I know literally nothing. So I'm not going to talk about that as if I do. But I will say that Nate is really cool. And if you weren't here last time, then you didn't get to hear me say that we met at the American Jewish University in Bel Air, which is in LA. And I was in rabbinical school and he was doing his undergrad. And Nate is a cool guy who served in the military. He's a veteran. Thank you for your service. And he is the owner and CEO of Westside Urban Gardens and just a cool guy. Oh, and the Jews of Color recruiter for Avodah, which is a great organization. So maybe Nate, you want to give us a little bit of background for those who are kind of newer to this one here last time about like, what's a nice Jewish boy doing being a farmer? And then talk about indoor gardening. So take it away, Nate.
All right, thank you very much. And I am so happy to be with you all this afternoon / evening. And essentially, I got into agriculture as a business student because I didn't want to go the same path as everyone else. And I realized that, you sit around a Shabbos table and everyone, had these office jobs. And I just was like, I spent 8 years in the military. I don't particularly want to go and do something that's just going to be, I know what every day is going to look like. And from being a person that tends to be more hands-on, I wanted a career that was going to both physically and intellectually engage me. Specifically right now, I'm realizing I've been doing urban agriculture for about 5 years now. My initial entry into the industry was all self-taught. I used YouTube videos and I started with building, I set up the grow tent that I'm gonna be showing today was my initial lab that I set up in my bedroom when I was finishing up at AJU. What's interesting now is we're in a period of time where everybody's at home under quarantine. And while growing food in your house you may not be able to grow enough on the onset to feed your family and never have to go to the grocery store again. Later on, I'll explain there are some crops that don't do well in these sorts of systems, but it's a great morale booster to have something in your house that you're growing every day. It's really nice to see something living. From one day to the next, the plants don't look the same. It gives you something else to do. And then at the end of the day, you've got a really, really healthy, nutritious food source. Even if you're only growing herbs and things like that, it's a great way to provide nutrients for your house and for your family. And then depending on the size scale of your system, you could be providing food for your whole neighborhood. It's a personal choice what size system you want to build. But for me, I thoroughly enjoy growing hydroponically, aquaponically, which I'll go into later today. As a veteran, a lot of veterans have chosen to go into agriculture after their service. One of the reasons being the fact that in the commercial ag industry, the majority of farmers are over the age of, I believe, 55 or 56. And so what's happening is we're getting to a point where farmers are aging out and there's no one to really replace them. So what's actually happened is veterans have stepped up and answered that call and answered the call to feed this nation in a new way. And at the same time, it has tremendous therapeutic benefits for people that are struggling with PTSD, depression, anxiety. I myself am a service-connected veteran with diagnosed PTSD. I find that having my hands involved in plants is the best medicine, hands down. So with all of that being said, what I want to do is I'm going to start with a slideshow presentation where I'm going to walk you through some of what what controlled environment agriculture is. And then from that, we're going to go into a tour of my grow system and then answer some questions for y'all. So let me do my screen share.
And while you're getting that rigged up, just as an FYI, because I didn't say it before, but if you have any questions for Nate about anything that he's covering in this session, if you have any lingering questions from last session, you can feel free to type them in the chat, or you can just message me directly if you don't want to have a name attached to a really, really good question. All questions are good questions for Nate. Thank you. Continue.
All questions are good questions in my book. The ones that you don't ask are the ones that aren't so good.
Exactly.
Okay. Let's see if I am doing this correctly. Oh, there it is. Okay. Right. You present. Okay, so we are talking about urban hydroponics and aquaponics. Specifically, I say hydroponics because that's going to be the primary focus. I'm going to talk about aquaponics because it's another technique of growing with water. But if you're just starting out, I find that operating an aquaponic system has a lot more challenges to it. And I strongly recommend leaning the hydroponic route. You can always build a hydroponic system with the intent of incorporating fish later, but start with the hydroponics system just because it's an easier bar and there's less moving parts with it. So to start, what is hydroponics? You know, in the US, hydroponics has kind of gotten a bad name and a bad rap because of industries that use it as their main growing technique. But essentially, all hydroponics is growing plants in sand, gravel, or water, or liquid, without using soil. So the reason why I say liquid is because once you add nutrients to that water, it's no longer just water. We call it a nutrient-rich solution. Some of the benefits of growing in a hydroponic system are, number one, it uses 70% less water than traditional soil-based growing. Now, there are several reasons why that's the case. The first being is when you have a hydroponic system, the water is contained in that system. It's not like when you water your grass, you know, 30% of the water hits your grass, the other 70% is running down the sidewalk and into the gutter. And in commercial agriculture, it's the same thing. The plants take as much as they need, and the rest of that water just keeps on going back down into the groundwater. And so for that reason, we use less water. The only reason why there is a 30% water usage is because with a hydroponic system, at some point you have to flush out that system and change out the water because the water quality will deteriorate. So when you factor that in, it's a little bit more water usage than a aquaponic system, excuse me. It has a smaller footprint. So when you're growing hydroponically, you don't need acres and acres and acres of field in order to grow your crops. You can grow extremely dense crops in a small footprint. So when I show you my tent is exactly 3 feet by 3 feet. And within that same space, I'm able to grow what I potentially would need a 10 foot, not even a 10 foot, I'll say like a 5 or 6 foot by 5 or 6 foot piece of space in order to grow the same type of crops. And it's also better, it's more adaptable in a non-traditional growing environment. Here we are, I live in an apartment in Long Beach, California. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful area. I live across the street from the beach, but I have no yard. I have a front door and I have windows. So I can't necessarily grow whatever crop I want to grow naturally because I just don't have the capabilities, the natural capabilities to do it. However, on the other side, there are some downsides to going hydroponics versus going traditional. Number one, it's a greater startup cost. You can take a plastic 1 gallon water jug, cut the top off of it, poke some holes in the bottom of it, throw soil in it, and put some tomato seeds, and you've got a new plant. Very, very minimal cost for starting up. However, with a hydroponic or aquaponic system, you have to create all of the infrastructure in order to start the plant. So before you can plant the first seed, you've got to create your water, you have to build a water reservoir, a place for the plants to grow, lighting, plumbing. So there are a lot of things that you have to factor in when you're setting up a system. There could be additional education that you need if you're doing a larger scale project. So say you've got a big backyard and hey, you want to throw up a greenhouse, a small, Home Depot style greenhouse. You're going to want to get additional training in order to operate that system successfully, because there are quite a few things that can go wrong. And you have a higher level of crop loss risk. So when you're planting in soil is a very stable way to grow crops. You can go maybe a day or two without watering it. You may start to see some variations in the crops, but it may not be that bad. Certain types of hydroponic systems, if that system shuts down, you have a very small window of time to get your system back up and running before you lose your crops. Different types of systems have different variables as far as what that timeline looks like, but you have a different sort of timeline. So for example, here in Los Angeles, and the system I'm gonna show in the next few slides, the power went out. So the power goes out. If you've got multiple pumps running on a system, what happens to the water? Where does it go naturally? What happens to your aeration? So there's higher risks. There's things that you can do to mitigate that risk, but just be aware that there's more risk involved in growing in a hydroponic system. Now, if we switch over to aquaponics, what is aquaponics? So aquaponics, this is the basic definition of it. It's using aquaculture to produce waste or some other aquatic animal, and that waste produces your nutrient system. So essentially, this is a modified hydroponic system. With hydroponics, you're taking synthetic nutrients and adding it to your system to give your plants the fertilizer that it needs. With the aquaponic system, you're not adding any fertilizer because your fish are producing the fertilizer for you. So what it's called is it's a semi-closed looped system. So what that means is the plants are, you feed your fish, the fish poop. That fish poop goes through a series of biofilters to take out the solids, and then it's just a nutrient-rich solution, the nitrogen. That nitrogen goes around to the plants. The plants take up the nitrogen that they need, and then the fresh water cycles back to the fish. Now, if you'll notice with this, the benefit is it's 90% less water than traditional soil-based growing. That's a whole 20% difference. Now, the reason why it's a 20% difference is because the only time you're adding water to the system is to account for what the plants take up, which is called transpiration, the minimal evaporation that'll happen maybe from your fish tank, and that's it. That's the only water loss that you have. So it's a very small amount of water that you're adding to an aquaponic system. Once again, it's a smaller cultivation footprint. You can have a system where your fish are on the bottom and then you have your plants growing on the top. And so now you have created a vertical hydroponic or aquaponic system. And so in the commercial world, we talk about how if you're growing aquaponically, it creates another revenue stream. For your personal backyard garden, if you say you want to do an aquaponic system, some of the best fish, the easiest fish to use for aquaponics are tilapia. Tilapia breed profusely. They are one of the fastest producers that you can buy, and they're very tolerant to the abuse that they can experience in an aquaponic system. Whereas if the temperature gets too high for some fish, it would kill them off, pretty much instantly. Tilapia can withstand very high temperatures. They can withstand high concentrations of ammonia in a system. They can deal with not so much really low temperatures, but they can withstand lower temperatures. So tilapia tends to be a really good fish. It's not exactly kosher, but catfish is another fish that is great for an aquaponic system. Depending on your climate, bass work. In Northern California, I know of some farms that use trout in their system. But if you're just doing like a home system in your house and you don't plan on harvesting out the fish, you can use goldfish. They're super cheap and they may die, but you can get some more. It's not a big thing. It's not, I wouldn't recommend starting an aquaponic system with koi, or large fish, because you really run the risk of losing the first fish that you put into that system. So there's a more significant, if we talk about challenges, there's a more significant startup cost. because now you're not only creating the infrastructure for your plants, but you're also creating an infrastructure for your fish. And this is something that's scalable. You can, like I've built systems that consisted of just a 10-gallon fish tank, and built up from that. And then I've worked with systems that had 60,000 gallons of water flowing throughout. So you can have any sort of scale of it, but the cost is definitely going to be more significant than if you just took, if you repurposed a water container and threw soil in it. There's also a higher risk of both crop loss and aquaculture loss, because now that you're incorporating fish, there are certain things that you have to be aware of. The main thing is your plants are going to be more durable to environmental changes. Your fish won't be. So if the pH in your system gets out of whack, which does happen, and you know, your plants they might look a little sad, but they'll still grow. Your fish will be floating in your system. So, you know, part of that one of the ways that we mitigate that risk is by using sensors. Once again, if you've got a really small system, sensors get to be a bit much. The best way to do it is, the best way that I find to monitor a system is just with a simple aquarium. They call it the aquarium chemical kits or the biological kits. It has your pH levels, your nitrates, nitrites, and ammonia. And there's a higher degree of human intervention required with the aquaponic system. So same thing with a hydroponic system, you have to kind of look in on it daily to a certain degree. You can set up a camera to watch it. You can automate the system, which is what I have with this system. It turns itself off and on, and you just use a Shabbat timer for that. Super low tech, but you still have to look in on it. When you have fish, you have to be monitoring the behavior of the fish. You know, if there's a sick fish, you need to get that fish out of the system. So it just tends to be a little bit more hands-on if you're doing a aquaponic system. My personal expertise is in aquaponics. I see that is the most efficient way to grow. It's an industry where the cost of growing aquaponically is continuously coming down, but it's a great learning tool. And if you have kids that are maybe in high school or middle school and you need a biology project, the starting up a fish tank is one of the best biological experiments that you can do, because what you're watching is the creation of beneficial bacteria. So what that means is, to start a system, you add ammonia to the water in the same way that fish create ammonia. Well, there's a bacteria called Nitromonas bacteria. That Nitromonas bacteria turns the ammonia into something called nitrites. And then the nitrites then go from nitrites to nitrates. And it's a really fascinating process to watch. As you test the water every day, you see that one day there's a whole lot of ammonia, and then the next day there's just a little bit of nitrites. And then the next day there's a whole lot of nitrites and only a little bit of ammonia. And then a few days later, there's a little bit of nitrates and a whole lot of nitrites. And it's a really fascinating thing to watch. So this is, and I'm showing you all this system. This is a very advanced system. This was a system I built last year that incorporates the 3 growing techniques for both hydroponic and aquaponics. This was an aquaponic system, and what we built was the 3 types. So DWC is a technique called deep water culture. My system that I'm going to show you today is a deep water culture system. What that means is the tanks that you see on top, the 3 black tanks on the top of the frame, each of those tanks gets completely filled with water, and you just have a raft that floats on the top, and the roots hang down in the bottom of the water. It's a really easy, low-tech way to build a system. One of the things about it is the weight of the water is important. Each gallon of water, I believe, weighs 8.46 pounds or something like that. So if you've got a tank that's got that holds 100 gallons of water, you have to factor in what's going on with that, or what you're going to do with that water weight, depending on where you're putting your system. So if we look at this as well, don't worry so much about what's going on at the bottom, but this right here is the fish tank. So the way this system worked is the water moved up from the fish tank and moved down into a sump system, and at the same time moved into these floating raft systems. And in the next photo, I'll show you the other types of growing techniques. So on this side, I have three what we call media beds. So a media bed is a different type of growing technique. So we've talked about deep water culture. Media beds are used in something called flood and drain. So what happens is each one of the beds has a individual spigot. That spigot fills the bed itself, and there's a bell siphon in here. What a bell siphon does is once the water hits a certain point, it creates a pressure vacuum and sucks all the water back out down into these tanks. So flood and drain systems are great because you don't really have to oxygenate your water in the same way, because the process of the water moving through the media irrigates or oxygenates as it goes through. Plants need about 1 ppm, that's parts per mole of oxygen. Fish need 6+. So if you're doing a hydroponic system, just by the water moving, the turbidity of the water, that is going to create your oxygen. Ideally, you want to add additional oxygen because it'll make your plants even happier, but they'll survive without the additional oxygen. So I've now shown you both sides of what this system looks like. And now this is what the system looked like after I finished constructing it. So now you can see better on the side with the media beds. We used lava rocks for these beds, and then the 3 bell siphons. Now, if you look in the front of this bed, you see this rail with double holes on it. That is the third technique that I want to talk about, which is called NFT. NFT stands for nutrient film technique. Nutrient film technique essentially just means that what you're doing is, instead of the plant either being completely submerged in the nutrient-rich solution or in a media bed, all that's happening is the roots are just getting a nice thin layer of nutrient-rich solution wicked across the bottom. This is a special trough that's used here, but you can do the same sort of thing with rain gutters. You can do this with PVC pipe. You would take a circular saw and cut your holes into it. So that's the third version. Now, of the 3, the most stable is going to be your deep water culture, because there's less moving parts. You can do it without having to incorporate pumps. Your next least challenging style would be your Nft channel, in that it's just a simple pump that's constantly circulating the water. However, if that pump goes down, your margin of error for fixing the crops is really, really slim, because it's once the roots start to dry out, your plants will be in distress. Now, with the flood and drain system, if you're using a bell siphon, bell siphons can sometimes fail. And when that happens, that can cause some problems in the system. So each one has its level of risk and cost for startup, which is something else that I'm going to jump into now. So you're trying to decide, what kind of system do you want to use? Like I said before, with an aquaponic system, you have to factor in feeding your fish, creating your system that's large enough to house your fish, the air pumps that you need for the system. So you can need to figure out exactly how much are you willing to spend on your system. There is a big range of how you can do it. You don't have to go out and buy a turnkey system if you don't want to. And then also, how much space do you have to devote to this system that you're building? You know, it's really beautiful to build a system that takes up, half of your dining room or something like that. But, 6 months into it, it just might be a little cumbersome. So with that, you should think about, what is your skill level? And, this is an introductory class, but what is your skill level around engineering, around chemistry? Nothing that's involved in one of these systems is too much for anyone, but just an understanding of where you are should help you decide how big or how small of a system you're willing to build. You can even do a hydroponic system in a mason jar. So it's a full range. So more advanced systems are going to require some level of additional training. You can do it on your own through trial and error, but the amount of error and the heartache, you might get a little disheartened about it and give up on it with some of the errors that could really be answered or fixed within a short period of time of getting training from someone. And then also, this is something I mentioned in the last class, of time commitment. Even with outdoor gardening, right now is a great time. Everybody's home, and it makes sense to build this big, beautiful garden. But then when things get back to what we consider to be our normal, that you might not have the same amount of time. And if that happens midway through summer, there are certain things that your crops are going to require that you're going to need to do. And if you don't do them, your garden isn't going to produce in the same way. Same thing for an indoor operation. There's less hands-on. You don't have to be weeding. There's less pest maintenance, because if you're using a closed system, you're able to keep out a lot of pests. So you don't have that to worry about as much, but you still have to maintain your plants. In my system, there are tomatoes growing, so I have to prune my tomato plants. You should be checking on your plants regularly to see if any of them need to be harvested. In a hydroponic in a hydroponic system in particular, you're adding nutrients at least once a week, testing your water quality, keeping up on the sanitation of your grow system. So there are things to factor in, and none of these things are really that time consuming depending on the scale of your system, but be aware that these are things that you need to think about. So what are the best crops for a hydroponic or aquaponic system? There are, the main go-to would be leafy greens. That is the easiest and the fastest crop to grow, aside from herbs, in a hydroponic system. From the time you plant the seed to the time you're harvesting it out, for lettuces, we're talking 30 days. In soil, you're looking at 45 to potentially 60 days, depending on the variety. So I'm cutting down my grow time significantly, and I'm growing on a smaller space. So to give you an idea of what that looks like, if you're growing on a floating raft system, which is the standard in commercial aquaponics or hydroponics, that raft is 2 feet by 4 feet. And so on an 8 square feet, I can grow up to 18 heads of lettuce to full size. I can't do that in soil, and do it significantly faster than someone that would do it in soil. Another crop that's great to grow in a hydroponic system is kale. And I have chard going in the system. I'll show you that shortly. Mustards, all of your mustard greens, your collard greens, things like that perform really well in these systems, as well as some of your other brassicas, like your cauliflower and broccoli, also grow well in the system. Now, keep in mind, if you are working with a small footprint of space and you choose to go with a broccoli, understand that broccoli is going to take up a lot of that space, and you're only going to get that one broccoli head. So, be conscious of how you're using the space. Tomatoes do great. Peppers do fantastic in hydroponic settings. Herbs grow like crazy. And of herbs, we're talking all of your cilantro, your parsley, your basil. Basil does amazing in a hydroponic setting. Cucumbers are primarily water, so they do fantastic in a hydroponic system. And then edible flowers. I'm not sure in your area if you all purchase edible flowers to throw in your salad, but in Los Angeles, edible flowers are really expensive. And so if you can grow your own nasturtium to put on your salad, it's fantastic. Now, there's some crops that just don't perform well in a hydroponic setting, specifically rooting crops. The reason why is because that root needs the soil in order to build the actual vegetable. So what happens in a hydroponic system is if you put like a carrot in a hydroponic system, you'll have this beautiful bushy carrot top and no carrot at the bottom. Something else that doesn't work well in a hydroponic system would be fruiting trees. It's great to irrigate your trees in one way, but to build the infrastructure to support trees, it's just really challenging. Trees tend to be permanent. When you're building a hydroponic or aquaponic system, the equipment you use only will last so long. Hops do perform well in a hydroponic setting. However, they are one of the worst when it comes to pests. So if you have hops in your system, you're going to be battling pests so much that it's not worth the hops that you're actually going to get out of it. Hops require a lot of height in order to be successful. So unless you've got 18 to 20 feet of vertical space to grow your hops, don't even waste your time on it. Grapes, same thing. As far as grapes really need soil. They thrive in really rich soil, and it's really hard to make that happen in a hydroponic system. Once again, corn is another thing that just doesn't, it will grow, but it won't grow well. So let me just check my timing really quickly. So a couple more things I want to talk about with cultivation is synthetic versus organic nutrients. If you intend to have a system be built and used as hydroponic and then switch over to aquaponics, understand that the nutrients that you put into that system may have a residual effect once you switch over to aquaponics if you don't properly clean that system. The reason being is with aquaponics, generally, if it's OMRI listed, and OMRI is Organic Materials Review Institute, and that's listed on all products that are organic for gardening. Organic products tend to be the safest for an aquaponic installation. I tend to use OMRI listed products in my hydroponic setups anyways, just because I like to be as far away from synthetic as possible. However, with hydroponics, it's very difficult to have hydroponic organic nutrients. They do sell them, but oftentimes what happens, you start building up biological matter in your system and your system gums up. My experience is those materials tend to smell bad after a while. So the synthetic nutrients tend to be the way to go with hydroponics, but just be aware that if you're switching over, to keep that in mind. So synthetic nutrients, they're fine, and they can be fine if you find the right varieties. But just keep that in mind that there is a difference and there's a reason for using the different materials. And like I said, anything that's OMRI listed is the way to go. So when we talk about grow media, there are several different types of grow media, and I'm actually going to stop my screen share for a second because I want to show you all what I'm currently, I can show you better than I can tell you. Okay, so when we're talking about grow medium, that is where your seed is going to be growing and rooting, and it's going to live in your system. I use grow plugs in particular. They are these spongy sort of peat moss type plugs that you can use in both an aquaponic or a hydroponic system. They're very easy to transplant. The plants, I find, germinate really well in these. I find that when I buy those compacted soil pellets from Lowe's, my germination rate is never as high as it is with these. So this is one type of grow medium. This is the one that I recommend. The next type of grow medium that people often use is something called rock wool. This is a rock wool slab. So it's this big, and this you don't need a slab this big. I just happen to have one on hand. So with rock wool, it's the same sort of concept as the grow plug, but instead of it just being a single plug, the plant lives in that totally. So with these plugs, what ends up happening is this is a netting cup. That plug gets put in the netting cup, and that's how the plant grows. So with the rock wool, you don't really need a netting cup. You can use one depending on the system you build, but this is the netting cup. And then the next thing I want to talk about is your lighting. There are different types of lights. The first one would be natural sunlight. If you have somewhere where you can access a greenhouse sort of space or have natural light, that's the best. It's free. The lights that I prefer to use are LED lights. That's light emitting diodes, and they come in various different wattages. I find that's the best to use because it puts out the least amount of heat and it requires the least amount of energy. and the plants respond to it really well. And I'll show you very shortly that you can dial them in and change the light spectrum based on what you're growing. So to show you an example of what an LED light looks like, or what an LED light strip looks like, I've got these here. And this is an example of what an LED light system looks like for a hydroponic system. The next type that I strongly turn you away from is the high pressure sodium. High pressure sodium lights are great if you are growing cannabis commercially. Outside of that, it is a complete waste of money. Number one, the actual light bulb doesn't have, it's not an indefinite light bulb. You have to change out those light bulbs, and they're expensive. The lighting system is expensive. It draws a significant amount of energy. And then on top of that, you also have to have an additional cooling system to cool off the heat that's put out by the light. So unless that's what you're doing, where you're trying to create a business out of something, stay away from them. It's not worth it. The next type of light you can use is your simple fluorescent light. And they work really well as well. I personally prefer to use the LED lights. So now that I've gone over lighting, a little bit of nutrients, a little bit of what the system looks like, now for the fun part. I realize we've got about 20 minutes, so I'm gonna walk us through my grow system. So I'm going to mute myself here, and then I'll join you all on my other camera. Okay. So, can you all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I think you can hear me. All right. So I'm going to walk you through my system. And like I said, this is a very small system. It's only 3 feet by 3 feet. Like I said, I use LED lights in my system. Now, the thing about this tent, it's not necessary to grow using a tent, but as you can see, it just makes everything a lot easier to manage and deal with. The thing about this tent is it's just a simple grow tent, but it has all of these special openings on it in order for me to access ventilation, lighting, and things of that nature. And also, it makes it easy to keep a consistent temperature in your tent if you have or around your plants if you have a tent. So some of the things on the top I want to walk you all through. In a hydroponic closed-in system, you have to have some sort of air blowing on your plants at all times. The plants need it to cool off. They also need it for pollination. I'm not going to put bees in my apartment, so I have to artificially create something to move the blossoms of my plants around. So if I pan up here, I can show you that my light is on a pulley system. So what that means is as my plants grow, I can raise my light or lower it. So when I first started these plants, the light was a lot further down, closer to the plants themselves. Now this is my LED. This is the LED light that I've used for probably about 3 or 4 years. I purchased it on Amazon, and it's still performing really well. What I like about it is the fact that I can switch my settings. So if I turn it off for a second, you can see that we've got 2 different settings, leaf and bloom. So when you're working to, when you want your plant to produce more green vegetation, I want to be more blue spectrum. And then when I need it to start to produce flowers, once the flowers are produced, then I would turn on that, and that gives me my red spectrum. So now let me jump on down here so we get to the good stuff, the plants. Now I'm gonna switch lights. Another thing to keep in mind is when you're working with LED lights or any sort of artificial lighting system, it's good to either protect your eyes or have some sort of alternative light. So I actually just have a small light bar right there that I use when I'm working in here. because you could really do some serious permanent damage to your eyes with this. So this is the system that I've built here. This is a deep water culture system, DWC system. And as you can see, I'm pretty sure some of y'all recognize this type of container. This is just a Home Depot storage container. And what I did is I used a circular saw and I cut holes in it and I put my netting cups directly in those holes. And my plants, once I open this, my plants, the roots are just down in here. Now check this out. If I lift this up and stick this in here, you can see all of my root systems are doing fantastic right now. The tomato in particular is doing really well. I don't know if you can see that back in the corner, the pink back there. Now that's my chard plant. Chard in particular, the roots match the stem. So sometimes you have some really beautiful chard roots. So with this type of system, because the water would be stagnant, I have, if I didn't have something moving the water around and creating air for my plants, I've got a simple aquarium aeration system. This is good for up to, I believe, 30 gallons of water. And then I just cut a little tiny hole in here and dropped an emitter in there. And then, if I move this out the way a little bit, you can see down in here now, there was a lot more to this plant yesterday, but I used it for dinner. So this is my chard, one of my chard plants that I put in here. These guys are a little bit they're getting a little sad just because I have too many in one container. So this is pretty much what the basics of a simple hydroponic system looks like. Now, if you wanted to build a system like this without the light, this would be the cost of this container, the netting cups, which you can get, you know, a pack of maybe 50 or something netting cups for $10, which you may not need that many, an aquarium aeration pump, which runs about 15 or 16 bucks, and then your grow cubes and seeds. And you can get a starter tray like this from Home Depot or Lowe's for about 25 bucks. So with that, I am going to switch back to the other camera, and actually I'll just stay with this camera. I'd love to answer your questions.
Okay.
If I can get it to turn around. Okay.
There you go. All right. Well, thank you for all that amazing information, first of all. And if anyone else has questions, you can feel free to kind of text or me keep texting those. Mostly texting questions are coming through, and put them in the chat if you'd like. But I'm going to go stick on the questions that we have currently. Sure. Someone asked, this is a serious question, can my fish get me sick through eating vegetables that they grow in/around if they get sick?
That's a good question. That's a very good question. And the answer in short is yes, they could. However, it's highly unlikely. Part of the reason why is when you're harvesting, essentially your fish should be they live in a separate part of the system than where your plants are growing. And also when it's really important to be conscious of your water droplets. So when I'm harvesting out of the system, I make sure that I'm not dripping water on the rest of my plants. Now, at the same time, you still wash all of your crops before you eat them. So it's really not a big issue. Technically, yes, it can happen. In the 5 years that I've been working with Aquaponics, I have not heard of anyone getting sick. So yes, it could potentially happen. You know, there's E. coli is a thing, Listeria is a thing. However, I haven't heard of anyone getting sick. And this was part of the issue when Aquaponics was trying to get organic certification. The certifying body said, well, it's coming too close in contact with animal manure. And it's like, well, what are you doing in the field? So it's the same thing, but yes, there could be risk.
Good to know. Good to know. Someone asked, can I start in hydroponic and transplant to soil?
Yes, you can. I actually have a plant that I took out of my system. I have some peas in the system that I did as an experiment to show people how fast things can grow. And I took that pea plant, one of the pea plants, and I just planted it straight into soil. The only thing about that is the fact that the roots are so vulnerable. You need to make sure that you water that plant really, really well on the onset in order to get the roots to establish. Part of growing in a hydroponic system is part of what takes less time is the fact that the plant doesn't have to send out energy to grow stabilizing roots to stabilize the plant. When a plant first starts, it webs out in a lot of different directions in order to hold the plant up. With a hydroponic system or aquaponic system, it's just sending out the roots that it needs for nutrients. So when you switch it into soil, it may not be able to hold itself up for a while. But yep, you can switch them over. And you can do the opposite. You can take something from soil and put it into a hydroponic system. It's a lot of work because you have to rinse all the soil off of the roots and you have to do it very carefully so you don't damage the plant, but it can be done.
Wow, okay, jeez. How do I do the mason jar thing?
So the mason jar thing is actually really cool. So you would take something like this, these netting cups, and depending on the size of your mason jar, you would just take a measurement of that. And any local hydroponic store sells these. And you would just take one of these cups. The best plant that I think of to use for this is the Trader Joe's basil or something like that. One of those living plants, you put it in this cup, and then you set that cup in the water. Now, the best way to add nutrients for something simple like that is something called fish emulsion. And they sell it in Home Depot, Lowe's. It smells terrible. The cats and dogs love it though. But a few drops of that in the system will give you the nutrient, or in the mason jar will give you the nutrients that you need. And then you just set one of these cups down in it, around the rim, because I don't know if you can see it, but it's got a little bit of a lip to it. And so you would just set it down in there like that and keep the plant going. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I was hearing all your descriptions. I was like, that sounds like more my speed than the mason jar thing. I think I could do that and not kill something.
Yeah, you still might kill it, but it's
Thanks for the vote of confidence.
I'm a realist when it comes to plants.
That's good.
Not basil, mint is very forgiving as well. So
that's good. The options, it's good to have options. Do you have a preferred plant food for things that you eat for soil? Like, they're growing something in soil. It's like an old question. It's like, so someone's growing something in soil and they want to use plant food, but they want to use plant food that they could then, eat whatever grows out of that plant.
So wait, someone's using soil.
They're growing in soil. This is like an old question from last week.
Okay.
And they want to know, like, do you have a preferred kind of plant food? They want to be able to use plant food, but they don't want to, like, poison their food that they're growing.
I see. I generally stick to organic certifications. Anything with an OMRI listing on it. I'm not brand specific around that. But my go-to is if it doesn't have an OMRI listing on it, especially when it comes to soil, anything soil-based, I don't use it. It's not the most toxic thing in the world because you're still eating healthy, fresh food. But I generally will lean towards anything with an OMRI listing on it. So, for example, I'm not sure if you have it out there, but Kellogg soil. They sell Kellogg soil, I believe, both at Lowe's and Home Depot, and they have several different varieties. They have a variety of soil that has nutrients in it. They have different varieties that are good for raised beds, in-ground operations, and they have quite a few. Most of their products are OMRI listed.
Cool. Question from someone who's growing in soil. So, throwback question. Something, I think it's a bug, is eating my potted plants. How do I figure out what it is and how to kill it, but also still be able to eat what I'm growing? And they put in parentheses, mostly mint and basil. Okay,
that's a good question. So the fact that it's mint and basil leads me to believe that it's probably a caterpillar issue, because this is around the time where caterpillars are trying to get good and full. The best way to tell what type of plant or what type of bug it is by how it's eating your plants. Caterpillars tend to start on the outside of the leaf and work all the way into the stem to the point where all you have is sticks left. The fastest, and they will turn a basil plant into nothing in like 48 hours if you let them. It can be really sad. Now the thing about it is with caterpillars, if you look at a leaf that looks like it's been freshly eaten and you flip it over, the main culprit is usually under the leaf, still hanging out because it's still munching. So if you have a situation where you're noticing things are starting to eat your plants, start just turning over those leaves around it. If you notice it's only one or two, we call it manual removal, meaning you just take your fingers and remove it and do with it what you want. The other thing to do would be use something called diatomaceous earth, which is a powder, and you can sprinkle that around the bottom of the plant. And what happens is it's actually powdered silica. As the bug crawls over it, it sends shards through its exoskeleton and dehydrates the bug. So that is another option. And then I also recommend using something called dead bug. And dead bug works great on lots of things. Also OMRI listed, but it's something that I find works really well. They do sell some beneficial bacterias that you can use to kill off caterpillars. But the easiest lowest hanging fruit would be, it could just be one or two. Or, and once you kill those, you might notice it goes away. But it's also something that when we talk about regular maintenance, it could be a weekly thing where you might go 3 weeks and you eradicated it, or you thought you did, and then the next thing you know, there's another one coming back. So it's all part of the process, and you're not doing it. If bugs want to eat what you're growing, you're doing something right. So
that's kind of a nice way of thinking about it. I like that.
Yeah.
Question: is there a flavor difference between hydro and soil grown plants?
Yes, there can be. I noticed that with tomatoes, not specifically with tomatoes I've grown myself hydroponically, but I noticed that most of the tomatoes that we eat in this country are grown hydroponically. Now, if you grow a tomato in soil and eat that tomato, it just tastes so rich and so amazing. And then if you take a hydroponic tomato, sometimes people say that it has a little bit more of a watery flavor profile and doesn't have the same level of richness. But if you're growing a fresh tomato, there's nothing like eating fresh tomatoes, whether it's in soil. But if you really are, like, for example, heirloom tomatoes don't particularly do well in a hydroponic setting. So yes, you would have a stronger flavor profile because of tomatoes grown in soil, but it's not enough to the point where you're not getting the true tomato flavor.
The last question we have is just kind of about your farm. It's like, when did you start your urban farm? How big is it, and what does it grow? What is it?
So I actually do not have a farm anymore, and that was a conscious choice. I had a commercial hydroponic microgreen farm, and I grew over 20 varieties of microgreens that I sold in farmers markets in the LA area and to chefs, catering companies, and things like that. So that system was a flood and drain system. My crops were ready anywhere from 7 to 14 days from the time that I started them, which meant it was extremely, extremely labor intensive. I was working about 80 hours a week at that point. There would be no way for me to be standing holding a camera right now if I were still operating my farm. But what I do is I build other systems, like the system that I showed in the slideshow. I design and build bespoke custom systems. That system that was in the photo, that's the only one in the world that exists that incorporates all 3 growing techniques in the same system. That system was built on the 3rd floor of a office building in downtown Los Angeles. So I'm really enjoying the stuff that I do now. So if I say I have a farm, y'all just saw it.
No, it's cool. Like, your innovation is just really, really cool, and I hope everybody appreciates the fact that you're doing things that are. I would consider it farming. Like, you are producing food, and it's just in such a new way of doing it, and which is also still kind of old because the basic principles, the way you explain it, it's all plants are plants.
Yeah. No, I come from a farming family. I'm a 5th generation farmer. We still have a farm in Louisiana, and my family has a farm in Louisiana, monocrop corn, soy, and it's been in the family 5 generations. I can't begin to call myself an expert in that.
Humility is a good trait in all people,
Yeah.
all professions. Well, thank you so much, Nate, for your time and your expertise and your willingness to answer questions. And I hope you stay safe and stay well. Thank you to everybody else for being a part of this. And we'll see you all around. Thanks, Nate.
This has been great. Thank you very much.
Everyone says thank you. They're chatting. Thank you.
I see.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. Good night and good afternoon.
Cool. And yeah.